On the evening of 13 November 2015, a series of coordinated terrorist attacks occurred in Paris and its northern suburb, Saint-Denis. Beginning at 21:20 CET, 3 suicide bombers struck near the Stade de France in Saint-Denis, followed by suicide bombings and mass shootings at cafes, restaurants, and a concert hall in Paris. The attackers killed 130 people, including 89 at the Bataclan Theatre, where they took hostages before engaging in a standoff with police. There were 368 people who were wounded, 80 to 99 seriously so. 7 of the attackers also died, while authorities continued to search for accomplices. The attacks were the deadliest on France since World War II, and the deadliest in the European Union since the Madrid train bombings in 2004. France had been on high alert since the January 2015 attacks in Paris that killed 17 people, including civilians and police officers. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant claimed responsibility for the attacks, saying that it was in retaliation for the French airstrikes on ISIL targets in Syria and Iraq. The President of France, François Hollande, said that the attacks were an act of war by ISIL planned in Syria, organized in Belgium, and perpetrated with French complicity. In response, a state of emergency was declared, and temporary border checks were introduced. On 15 November, France launched the biggest airstrike of Operation Chamel, its contribution to the anti-ISIL bombing campaign, striking ISIL targets in Al-Raqqa. On 18 November, the suspected lead operative of the attacks, Abdulhamid Abaoud, was killed in a police raid in Saint-Denis, along with at least 2 other people. Background: France had been on high alert for terrorism since the Charlie Hebdo shooting and a series of related attacks in January by militants belonging to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and had increased security in anticipation of the 2015 United Nations Climate Change Conference, scheduled to be held in Paris at the beginning of December, as well as reinstating border checks a week before the attacks. Throughout 2015, France witnessed smaller attacks. The February stabbing of 3 soldiers guarding a Jewish community center in Nice, the June attempt to blow up a factory in Saint-Quentin-Fallavier, and the August shooting and stabbing attack on a passenger train. The Bataclan Theatre had been threatened a number of times because of its public support for Israel. 2 Jewish brothers, Pascal and Joel Lalou, owned the Bataclan for more than 40 years before selling it in September 2015. In 2011, a group calling itself Army of Islam told French security services they had planned an attack on the Bataclan because its owners were Jewish. In the weeks leading up to the Paris attacks, ISIL and its branches had claimed responsibility for several other attacks. The downing of Metrojet Flight 9268 on 31 October and the suicide bombings in Beirut on 12 November. Intelligence agencies in Turkey, Iraq and Israel had all warned of an imminent attack on France months beforehand, but were ignored by the French authorities. Attacks. Timeline of attacks: 13 November, 21:21 suicide bombing near the Stade de France, 21:25 shooting at the Rue Bichat, 21:32 suicide bombing near the Stade de France, 21:32 shooting at the Rue de la Fontaine-aux-Oies, 21:36 shooting at the Rue de Charonne, 21:40 suicide bombing on Boulevard Voltaire, 21:43 men entered the Bataclan Theatre and began shooting, 21:53 third suicide bombing near the Stade de France, 2200 hostages are taken at the Bataclan. 14 November, 0:20 security forces enter the Bataclan. 0:58 French police end the siege on the Bataclan. All times SET. 3 teams launched 6 distinct attacks. 3 suicide bombings in one attack, a 4th suicide bombing in another attack, and shootings at 4 locations in 4 separate attacks. Shootings were reported in the vicinity of the Rue Libre, the Rue de la Fontaine-Noire, the Rue de Charonne, the Bataclan Theatre, and Avenue de la République. 3 explosions occurred near the Stade de France, another on Boulevard Voltaire, and 2 of the Bataclan shooters also detonated their suicide vests as police ended the standoff. According to the Paris prosecutor, the attackers wore suicide vests that used acetone peroxide as an explosive. Stade de France explosions. 3 explosions occurred near the country's national sports stadium, the Stade de France, in the suburb of Saint-Denis, resulting in 4 deaths, including the 3 suicide bombers. The explosions happened at 21:20, 21:30, and 21:53. The first explosion near the stadium was about 20 minutes after the start of an international friendly football match between France and Germany, which President Hollande was attending. The first bomber was prevented from entering the stadium after a security guard patted him down and discovered the suicide vest. A few seconds after being turned away, he detonated the vest, killing himself and a bystander. Investigators later surmised that the first suicide bomber had planned to detonate his vest within the stadium, triggering the crowd's panicked exit onto the streets where 2 other bombers were lying in wait. 10 minutes after the first bombing, the second bomber blew himself up near the stadium. Another 23 minutes after that, the third bomber's vest detonated nearby. According to some reports, that location was at a McDonald's restaurant. Others state that the bomb detonated some distance away from any discernible target. Hollande was evacuated from the stadium at halftime, while the German Foreign Minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, remained at the stadium. Hollande met with his Interior Minister Bernard Cazeneuve to coordinate a response to the emergency. 2 of the explosions were heard on the live televised broadcast of the match. Both football coaches were informed by French officials of a developing crisis, but players and fans were kept unaware of it until the game had finished. Hollande, concerned that the safety of the crowd outside the stadium could not be assured if the match was immediately cancelled, decided that the game should continue without a public announcement. Following the game, the fans were brought onto the pitch to await evacuation as police monitored all the exits around the venue. Security sources said all 3 explosions were suicide bombings. The German national football team was advised not to return to their hotel, where there had been a bomb threat earlier in the day, and they spent the night in the stadium on mattresses, along with the French team, who stayed with them in a display of camaraderie. Restaurant shootings and bombing. Rue Bichat and Libre. The first shootings occurred around 21:25 on the Rue Bichat and the Rue Libre, near the Canal Saint-Martin in the 10th arrondissement. Attackers shot at people outside Le Carillon, a café and bar, before crossing the Rue Bichat and shooting people inside the restaurant Le Petit Cambodge. According to French police, an eyewitness said one of the gunmen shouted, "Allahu Akbar." Le Monde reported that 15 people were killed at these locations and 10 were critically injured. The assailants fled in 1 or 2 vehicles after the shootings. One vehicle had a Belgian number plate. Doctors and nurses from the nearby Hôpital St. Louis were in Le Carillon when the attacks happened and supplied emergency assistance to the wounded. Rue de la Fontaine-Noire at 21:32, a man with a Kalashnikov rifle fired shots outside Café Bon Bière, close to the terrace of the Italian restaurant La Casa Nostra, on the Rue de la Fontaine-Noire, where it intersects with the Rue du Faubourg de Temple south of the Rue Bichat. The Paris prosecutor said 5 people were killed and 8 were injured. An eyewitness reported a gunman firing short bursts. Rue de Charonne at approximately 21:36. 2 gunmen fired shots for several minutes at the outdoor terrace of the restaurant La Belle Equipe on the Rue de Charonne in the 11th arrondissement, where it intersects the Rue Faidherbe. before returning to their car and driving away. 19 people were killed, and 9 were left in critical condition. Boulevard Voltaire bombing at about 21:40 on the Boulevard Voltaire in the 11th arrondissement, near the Place de la Nation. A man sat down in the Comptoir Voltaire Café and placed an order before detonating his suicide vest, killing himself and injuring 15 people, one of them seriously. Bataclan Theatre massacre at approximately 21:40. A mass shooting and hostage-taking occurred at the Bataclan Theatre on the Boulevard Voltaire in the 11th arrondissement. The American band Eagles of Death Metal was playing to an audience of around 1,500 people. About an hour into the concert, a car pulled up outside the venue and 3 dark-clad men with AKM assault rifles entered the hall. Witnesses heard shouts of "Allahu Akbar" just before the gunmen took up positions on the mezzanine and opened fire on the crowd. Initially, the audience mistook the gunfire for pyrotechnics. The attack lasted 20 minutes, and witnesses also reported seeing the attackers throw hand grenades into the crowd. A radio reporter attending the concert described the attackers as calm and determined, telling CNN they had reloaded 3 or 4 times. Survivors escaped via the emergency exit into the street or made their way onto the roof, with some taking refuge in toilets and offices. Others lay still on the floor pretending to be dead. The band's members escaped without injury. Around 2200, the attackers took 60 to 100 concertgoers hostage as police gathered outside the venue. They threatened to decapitate a hostage and throw the corpse out the window every 5 minutes. A witness who escaped told a journalist that the gunman had mentioned Syria. One witness in the Bataclan heard a gunman say, "This is because of all the harm done by Hollande to Muslims all over the world." There were further attacks on police and first responders who arrived at the scene. Starting at 22:15, a brigade of research and intervention arrived on the scene, followed by the elite tactical unit, RAID. The assault on the theatre began at 0:20 and lasted 3 minutes. Police launched the assault because of reports that the attackers had started killing hostages. They initially estimated that 100 people had been killed, but the toll was revised to 89. 2 attackers died by detonating their suicide vests. Another was hit by police gunfire and his vest blew up when he fell. Identification and removal of the bodies took 10 hours. A process made difficult because some audience members had left their identity papers in the theater's cloakroom. Perpetrators. On the 14th of November, ISIL claimed responsibility for the attacks. François Hollande said ISIL organized the attacks with help from inside France. Claimed motives were an ideological objection to Paris as a capital of abomination and perversion, retaliation for airstrikes on ISIL in Syria and Iraq, and the foreign policy of Hollande in relation to Muslims worldwide. Shortly after the attacks, ISIL's media organ, the Al Hayat Media Group, launched a website on the dark web extolling the organization and recommending the encrypted instant messaging service Telegram. Fabian Klein released an audio recording the day before the attacks in which he personally claimed responsibility for the attacks. Klein is known to intelligence services as a veteran jihadist belonging to ISIL, and of French nationality. Syrian and Egyptian passports were found near the bodies of 2 of the perpetrators at 2 attack sites. But Egyptian authorities said the passport belonged to a victim, Alid Abdel Razak, and not one of the perpetrators. By the 16th of November, the focus of the French and Belgian investigation turned to Abdul Hamid Abaoud, the radical jihadist they believed was the leader of the plot. Abaoud, a Belgian of Berber Moroccan origin, had escaped to Syria after having been suspected in other plots in Belgium and France, including the thwarted 2015 Thalys train attack. Abaoud had recruited an extensive network of accomplices, including 2 brothers, Brahim Abdislam and Salah Abdislam, to execute terrorist attacks. Aboud was killed in the St. Denis raid on 18 November. All of the known Paris attackers were EU citizens, who crossed borders without difficulty, albeit registered as terrorism suspects. According to the French Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, several of the perpetrators had exploited Europe's immigration crisis to enter the continent undetected. At least some, including the alleged leader Abdelhamid Aboud, had visited Syria and returned radicalized. Jean-Charles Brissard, a French expert on terrorism, called this a change of paradigm, in that returning European citizens were themselves the attackers. The Los Angeles Times reported that more than 3,000 Europeans have traveled to Syria and joined ISIL and other radical groups. Identification: 3 teams, comprising 3 people each, executed the attacks. They wore explosive vests and belts with identical detonators. 7 perpetrators died at the scenes of their attacks. 3 suicide bombers blew themselves up near the Stade de France. Bilal Hadfi, a 20-year-old French citizen who had been living in Belgium. Hadfi attempted to enter the Stade de France but blew himself up nearby after being denied entry. He fought with ISIL in Syria for more than a year and was a supporter of the Nigerian extremist group Boko Haram. In the months before the attacks, he was active on social media, posting pro-jihadist messages, and communicated with a Libyan branch of ISIL. Belgian prosecutors knew Hadfi had gone to fight in Syria but did not know of his return to the EU. Al-Mahmoud, who had entered the EU with Syrian refugees via the Greek island of Leros on 3 October. The final bomber carried a passport belonging to a 25-year-old Syrian named Ahmed al-Mohammed. A passport holder claiming to be a Syrian refugee with that name was registered on Leros in October upon his arrival from Turkey. The dead attacker's fingerprints matched those taken at the registration on Leros. French officials concluded that Ahmed al-Mohammed is probably a dead Syrian soldier whose passport was stolen after he was killed in Syria. 3 men carried out the shootings at bars and restaurants in Paris. Brahim Abdeslam, a 31-year-old French member of the Molenbeek terror cell living in Belgium, carried out shootings in the 10th and 11th arrondissements. Shortly afterwards, he blew himself up at the Comptoir Voltaire restaurant on the Boulevard Voltaire. Abdelhamid Aboud, an unidentified suspect. 3 other men attacked the Bataclan theater using AKMs and took hostages. 2 blew themselves up when police raided the theater. The third was hit by police gunfire and his vest blew up when he fell. According to French police, they were Sami Amimour, a 28-year-old from Paris who fought in Yemen and was known to the intelligence services, had reportedly been on the run from police since 2012 due to being wanted over terrorism-related charges. Omar Ismail Mosfer, a 29-year-old from the Paris suburb of Cour-Coronis, traveled to Syria in 2013 and may have spent time in Algeria. In 2010, the French authorities put Mosfer on a database of suspected Islamic radicals. He was identified by a severed finger found inside the Bataclan. Fouad Mohammadagard, a 23-year-old from Strasbourg who traveled to Syria in 2013. Search for accomplices. 3 cars were recovered in Paris after the attacks. A Volkswagen with Belgian license plates abandoned near the Bataclan was hired by a French citizen living in Belgium and contained a parking ticket from the town of Molenbeek. A seat was found in the Paris suburb of Montreuil on 15 November and contained assault rifles. A Renault hired by Salah Abdeslam was discovered near Montmartre on the 11th of November and contained assault rifles. Police described Abdeslam, a 26-year-old Belgian citizen, as dangerous, and warned the public not to approach him. His brother, Brahim, died in the attacks. Another brother, Mohammed, was detained on 14 November in the Molenbeek area of Brussels and released after several hours of questioning. Mohammed said he did not suspect his siblings of planning anything. On the 14th of November, a car was stopped at the Belgium-France border and its 3 occupants were questioned then released. 3 more people were arrested in Molenbeek. Links to the ISIL attack in France were investigated in an arrest in Germany on the 5th of November, when police stopped a 51-year-old man from Montenegro and found automatic handguns, hand grenades and explosives in his car. On 15-16 November, French tactical police units raided over 200 locations in France, arresting 23 people and seizing weapons. Another 104 people were placed under house arrest. On the 17th of November, police followed a cousin of the attacker and ringleader, Abdulhamid Abaoud, to a block of flats in St. Denis where they saw Abaoud with her. The next day, police raided a flat in St. Denis, and Abaoud was killed in the ensuing gunfight, which lasted several hours. 8 suspected militants were arrested at or near the flat. On the 23rd of November, an explosive belt was found in a litter bin in the Paris suburb of Montrouge. It may have been discarded by Salah Abdeslam, a fugitive whose phone records showed that he was in Montrouge on the night of the attacks. On the 24th of November, 5 people in Belgium had been charged on suspicion of their involvement in the Paris attacks, and Belgian prosecutors issued an arrest warrant for Mohamed Abrini, a 30-year-old suspected accomplice of Salah Abdeslam. A person involved in the attacks made phone calls to Birmingham just prior to the day of the attacks. Fabien Klein was identified as the person reading the ISIL claim of responsibility. Klein is a French national who served 5 years from 2009 to 2014 in a French prison for recruiting fighters to go to Syria for jihad. Klein has been linked to other executed and planned terror attacks and is seen as a leader of known terrorists. Analysis of tactics. Michael Leiter, former director of the United States National Counterterrorism Center, said the attacks demonstrated a sophistication not seen in a city attack since the 2008 Mumbai attacks and that it would change how the West regards the threat. Further comparisons were made between the Paris attacks and the Mumbai attacks. Mumbai Police Joint Commissioner Devin Bharti pointed out the similarities as having several targets, shooting indiscriminately, and the use of improvised explosive devices. According to Bharti, the key difference was that the attackers in Paris did not attempt to prolong the attack and blew themselves up at the first hint of capture. Evidence points to the attackers having regularly used unencrypted communications during the planning of the attack. Casualties. The attackers killed 130 victims and injured between 352 and 368, with 80 taken to hospital in serious condition. Of the dead, 89 died at the Bataclan Theatre, 19 at La Belle Equipe, 15 at La Carillon and Le Petit Cambodge, 5 at Café Bonbira and La Casa Nostra, and 1 at Stade de France. Victims were confirmed from at least 26 countries. Among those who died at the Bataclan were a music critic of Les Inrocuptibles, an executive of Mercury Records France, and the merchandise manager of Eagles of Death Metal, the band that was performing. Some people suffered from PTSD.